We're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming. Once again, welcome to the 2019 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is JB Kalin. I am a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panel, the People Advantage, Culture Analytics. Our panelists are Jessica Gelman, CEO, Kraft Analytics Group, Daryl Morey, General Manager of the Houston Rockets, and Nate Silver, statistician, author, and founder of 538. Our panel today will be moderated by Adam Grant, professor at Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. So our panel today will last about 45 minutes, and at the end we'll save some time for Q&A. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so via Twitter using the hashtag #CultureData. And with that, I'll hand it over to Adam.
All right, let's get this show on the road.
Let's do it.
So we are about at the 10-year anniversary of the Michael Lewis article on the No Stats All-Star on Shane Battier. Obviously a big cultural force, both on your team, Daryl, but also in this orbit. So I texted Shane earlier today to find out what his 10-year reflections were. And he said, please thank Daryl for me for trading me when my wife was on bed rest.
It's a true story. Yeah.
Please discuss.
He told me the one thing he wanted was me to not trade him in his last year. But he's so smart. He should have known we needed to trade him. We were transitioning from Yao Ming and Tracy McGrady to James Harden. And what really bothers him is not that Heidi, his wife, was on bed rest. What bothers him is that he was traded for Hashim Thabit. Which is actually true. And I couldn't, no matter how many times I explained there was a draft pick involved, he didn't want to hear it, so.
Is the question, though, was that good from a people? I mean, are you still friends?
We
Do you
are
regret
so,
it?
I think so, I don't know. He's not here. I would say, for sure. So we took a lot of heat in that era. This is maybe the more interesting part, that we had a lot of player turnover. And I would agree that setting the culture correctly during that period was extremely challenging. I even told my friends, hey, get a jersey with your own name on the back, because that's safer at that time. And the reason for that is, we were not going to take, which is to be frank, the more reliable, more high probability path of getting a very high draft pick in the NBA. So if you're not going to do that, there's really only one way to still get yourself back into contention, and that's through trade. So even though we didn't like what it did for our culture in that period, there was a greater good, which was to get back to being a contender.
Cool. So one of the things I want to talk about this afternoon is how do you actually get inside people's heads? So, I think we've all looked up to players like Shane. In my terms, he was clearly a giver, not a taker, right? Who was constantly trying to elevate his team. You have to respect the humility there. And I think what's interesting about this panel is that you all have expertise on getting inside people's heads. So Nate, you do that with voters. You did that a long time ago with players as well. Daryl, you do that with athletes as well as with staff. Jessica, you do a ton of that with fans and customers. And so I think one of the hardest things about all of our lives is trying to figure out, well, who is this person before I've actually gotten a chance to get to know them? And so I want to try to figure out what we can all learn from each of your expertise on that. Jessica, I'd love to start with you. So can you tell us, from all the work you've done at Kraft Analytics and throughout your career, how is it that you go about understanding what fans really want? And why are the Patriots so beloved?
I don't think outside of Boston they're beloved.
I mean here, right? Because the rest of us do hate them. Yes, but go on.
Right, because, you should feel pretty good, though. Eagles won last year, so, wow.
You let someone in there.
I know. It's a great question, and kind of the whole background of, I studied psychology in college, and always was very interested in trying to figure out how customers think and what is of most interest to them. And I happened to start working in sports at a time when there was a lot more data that was available. We've had a lot of discussions today about that, but the most significant is we could track information specifically to a person through email, really to start, and then it's grown. Attendance, you can see when people are coming to games. So there's all of this data about what our customers are doing. And the other part, which I think is often lost, is what are they saying? And so and by the way, you have to have both of those pieces of information. One of the two, or both, can give you some insights, a deeper insight that you might then go do more analysis on. And I think the qualitative stuff, I would say, when I was running various business operations for Craft Sports and Entertainment, after the first game of the season, I would get the survey that we had sent out, and it was often 40 pages of feedback. And I would just read it and kind of say, what was the experience that the fans had? And it was a lot of information, obviously, but I think fans in particular, they want to know that someone's listening. And so providing that information back, but then from there, if we heard that this is a very specific example, but that they couldn't hear or the speaker was off in a specific part of the section, we would fix it. And we would do that type of work. And then you can go much deeper into, are there bigger issues from an analytic perspective that we need to be looking at to look for trends? But from that perspective, always kind of starting with what are the customers saying, and then what are their actual behaviors?
I think one of the challenges that we all face is actually what in the software world would be called eating your own dog food, right? Saying, okay, I have all this expertise, do I actually apply it to my own job? So Nate, tell us when you hire people, what are the interview questions you ask, and how do you figure out whether somebody is actually a person you'd want to work with you?
You try to make sure they're not an asshole.
How?
By having a conversation with them. I think the actual, look, we exist at 538 in a universe of a very small amount of people. By the way, I'm not someone who says that all behavior can be quantified or that you always want to use the metric. What I'm saying is if you want to use metrics, I can tell you how to do a good job with doing that to measure what you want to measure, right? When we're hiring people at 538, what we are trying to measure, it's, we want to know, roughly speaking, how much good journalism does someone do? And there's not necessarily a great metric for that. You can look at traffic, but if you write an article about whether LeBron James or Michael Jordan is the best player of all time, that's going to get a lot more traffic than writing about crime statistics in Newark, New Jersey or something, for example. And so you kind of, in some ways, basketball, baseball, other sports are very unique in that you're measuring about 80% of what you want to measure, or 90%, or I don't know, right? People complain about the 10% that you can't measure defense that well, right? You can't measure spacing that well, though you can increasingly, right? But you're still a lot further down the road toward what you want to measure than you are in most fields. Look, I think there is evidence that if you have a structured interview process, that tends to help. And so making sure that you kind of have the same people conducting the interview to kind of ask people the same questions for the most part. I think looking at kind of performance of people as they're progressing in the organization. One thing that's a challenge working for a big organization like ABC News, which owns 538, which is owned by the Walt Disney Company, is that there sometimes isn't enough flexibility with what you can do with high performers. So we'll face situations where we'll take someone who's clearly very good. You learn a lot more about someone, in the first 6 months to a year of them doing work for you than you would learn in any interview setting, right? Or even from you get references. References we found are not always that reliable necessarily, and doesn't always translate from one context to the next. But we certainly do learn a lot about people in their first 6 months to a year, and sometimes I don't have enough tools to enact that, right? Someone might literally be underpaid by 2x or something, right? Well, it's hard to enact that in a system where, the average raise is 3% or someone. Someone might be overpaid. That's a different type of problem. Someone might be someone who is not succeeding in it's actually very hard to move them out at a company that's big and bureaucratic. And so in some ways, we can't be as flexible as we would want, and that probably makes us maybe a little bit more conservative some ways in our hiring decisions. But I do think, I started with people shouldn't be assholes. One thing you learn is in a kind of workplace setting, someone who is detrimental to the culture, they do not recoup that no matter how good their work is in a technical sense, right? It just winds up taking so much bandwidth from management. It lowers morale so much. We work in an office where people are pretty young. It's a lot of millennials, for example, and so millennials all talk to one another about how they feel about their work experience. They talk to one another about how they feel about their their salary and compensation and kind of what they're asked to do, and are they given a fair shake? So you have to assume that you actually have to lead by creating a good, transparent, and like honest culture. And you can't manage an organization of millennials at least by saying, okay, well, you have this one conversation with one person, another one with another person. It's journalists too, right? They all find out everything that you say. And so operating the principle that people are going to be aware of everything and be smart about everything and will, do reporting on like rumors and stuff about like involving their lives and their company and just kind of proceed from there.
So let's dive into that. How do you screen out an asshole question? I think it's an important one. Daryl, Jessica, when you think about drafting, when you think about hiring, what are the questions you ask? What are the clues that you look for? How do you get references to be more honest?
I'll take assholes, actually.
Really?
They're good enough, yeah.
Where do you draw the line on
So
that,
I
though?
would disagree. I mean,
He also traded Shane when his wife was on bed rest. So. Just saying.
Yes, exactly. No, I mean, generally, we always have a no asshole rule, but we are in a sport where an elite talent can overcome things. So I would say, talking to my peers in the industry, like pretty much all the top players, I wouldn't say honestly they're assholes, but they all have their own set of issues, basically. And our job is often to sort of work with those, but then you try and put a very complementary team both on the court and off around them to create a positive culture. And I would say for drafting, the reason why everyone should know that everyone's bad at hiring, I still have yet to see anyone who's good at it, is we spend millions and millions of dollars on people who we get to see them actually perform their job prior to hiring them. And it's still like 70%, something around there, error, and 30%, what is it, noise? And
Signal.
Signal, thank you, that's the one. And,
That book you wrote?
yeah, that book. And so, like, if we spend that much time and multiple people and a structured process, and we get to watch them perform their job, and we still are this bad, then it just shows you that, we have a lot to learn still. And I know Google's done a lot as well, and it just feels like we're not moving fast enough.
So this is my world, right? So as an organizational psychologist, these are the kinds of things that we study. And I think that one of the reasons that so many of us are bad at hiring is we're just not using the right tools that have been studied for decades. So let's throw out a couple.
We're gonna learn something. This is good.
Love the structured interview idea is one example, but I think most leaders don't go far enough. So yes, you want to have a set of valid questions that you ask everybody, but you also want to go to your stars and your average and poor performers and ask them your interview questions, and then build an answer key. And then you can begin to compare, okay, what do the people who have really excelled at this job say consistently, or what do they do consistently that's different from the people who are not quite as good? And that helps a little, right? It's kind of like when I give students a test, if I don't have an answer key, it's really hard to know who got the answers right and who got them wrong.
Why don't you just hire the same people, though? Would you just get, like,
maybe.
homogeneity? Like,
maybe.
Okay.
But I think it's probably better for screening out people who are going to destroy your culture than it is saying, here's who I should hire. Another thing we do is in reference checks. We'll say, okay, look, every reference is too positive, right? So instead of just asking, tell me about this candidate and their strengths and weaknesses, we give a forced choice between two negatives. And we say, what's more likely, that this person is a little bit too selfish or a little bit too much of a pushover? What's more likely, that this person beats himself up too much or herself up too much or doesn't care enough about mistakes? And references don't know what the right answer is. And so they often tend to give us the honest answer.
What I ask when on the references is, I said, help me coach them better. What can, they're coming to work for me. What can I learn, or what can you tell me that I should, and I'm not saying be out, like be on the lookout for, but that's how
they work too hard.
Yeah, that one. They're too competitive.
Yes.
Is that the telltale sign of an asshole, when a reference says someone's too competitive?
No, so your first question was, what is the first question that someone asks? So my first question is, I'm usually the last person to interview the person, and I ask them what they heard today, and I'm not actually really listening what they say. I'm listening if they know the names of the people who interviewed them. So, whoops.
I mean, I do sometimes feel like maybe there's too much weight put on. There are certain people who are very skilled at like winning the interview process or like the job acquisition process. And I think sometimes like we actually probably, when we made hires that didn't feel like they worked out. And by the way, we assume that like, I don't know where I came up with this metric, but it's been kind of empirically true. We assume that like 15% of hires are just not going to work out, right? Just kind of from the start are miscast. Of course, you don't know what those 15% are, and you'd be surprised, you know, some of the people who I thought would for sure work out were in that 15% probably. But I do think like not reverting enough to your priors about like, has this person done high quality work in a similar setting? It's very basic, right? You know, so if they're a little bit more charming in an interview or they cobble together like really good references, I mean, still, like again, we're hiring for a very specialized skill set, not as specialized as like being able to shoot a three-pointer or something, but fairly specialized. And so if there is proof that you have done that work in another setting, then that counts for a lot. And if there's not, then like kind of test where we can simulate that environment by giving like an editor, for example, an edit test. And they have a finite amount of time to edit the story, right? That should be weighted heavily. I think maybe we don't even weight it heavily enough because someone's, oh, they're a nice person and they're funny. I can imagine getting a beer with that person, right? I mean, you're not trying to like, you know, on the one hand, an asshole can be very disruptive, but you're also not trying to select people to be your friends when you're hiring. We want people to be successful so your business can grow, and that all the other people at work feel like they're getting, have a good teammate now to work with. And so I do think like, you know, maybe if you went to the extreme of not really hiring with an interview process at all, maybe you could even think about that potentially.
So the other thing is, I kind of have a unique perspective in that I was working for a team and then now I'm working for, you know, a technology company, and the types of people who are attracted to the team, and you're inundated with people who want to go work at a team. Not that you're not when you're doing tech with an organization that works across lots of teams, but you're looking for specialized skill sets. And obviously what we all want are people who are referred to us, that from someone you know who knows the quality of their work. But then as you're at a pace where you're, in many cases, at the forefront of change and trying to make new things happen, the types of skills that you need are not going to probably be coming from people or that are that you know maybe. And that to me was the biggest shift that I had to kind of address.
So I think one of the big challenges that we all face here is you're trying to look at individual skills a lot. But in sports, you care a lot about the impact of those skills on the team, right? And you want players who are not just going to try to advance their own success, but try to do what's best for the team. And so I'd love to see if we can figure out, how do you know whether somebody's going to be a good team player? And maybe we can start by actually figuring out if you all are good team players. So here's my favorite question that comes out of the research on kind of this broad giver-taker dynamic.
Oh boy.
The question is, let's think about a selfish behavior like stealing from a team or a company. And the question is, what % of employees in the United States do you think steal at least $10 from their company in a typical month? So
from what? You
so
mean like from a cash till or something?
So we'll
Like
include
paper?
cash, IP, materials, and merchandise.
Like Post-it notes? Like what are we talking about?
Sure, if that helps you, Daryl.
Okay, I'm trying to picture what we're stealing. That's all. Okay.
Anything, just $10 net per month. What % of employees do it?
What if you park in like the boss's spot? Is that worth $10? So I'm
Depends
trying to
on who your
understand the
boss
question.
is.
Okay.
Depends
good.
who your boss
All right,
is.
Okay, sorry.
You want me to start, not the statistician?
We'll put Nate in the hot seat first.
40%.
It seems like it would be super low. Like I'm naive, I guess. Like 5%.
I was going to go with 15.
15. All right, so what's the real answer? I have no idea.
Oh.
Nor do I care what the answer
She did
is.
the human thing. She just took the average.
Which is not a bad strategy.
Uh,
I do care, though, a lot about what you think the answer is, because the data show the higher your estimate that other people are thieves, the greater the chances, Nate, that you're a thief. So, Daryl, I'd check your wallet right now, since he's within striking distance. But
Okay.
I think the psychology of this is really fun, because when a lot of people make these forecasts about others' behavior, they start by asking themselves, well, what would I do? Or what have I done? And then they project that onto others. So like the most selfish takers will say, let's see, what % of people would steal $10 from a company? Because takers always talk like that. Like, last week I stole $384, gotta be pretty common, 94%. And meanwhile, the more generous givers are saying, like, how do you even steal $10? Like, how many pens do you have to take home?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to understand.
Yeah, it's like a couple hundred Post-it notes, right?
This resonates with me. You know, I had a
Does it?
player. I had a player in the past that was always accusing other players of faking injuries. Meanwhile,
He's the biggest faker.
he was the biggest faker. So like, we never accuse players of Because they really don't. Like, it's a really hard sport. No, I don't think anyone really fakes. But this player legit was like accusing our other players of faking injuries, which is detrimental. So it didn't make any sense. But then we figure out he was probably doing it. So
That does seem to be, I mean, that is one of the ways people justify selfish behavior, right? It's not me. I think all of you people are like that. And so I've just got to be that way in order to protect myself.
Well, I see the fact that you pose that question, though, affects my answer, right?
How so?
Because
Wait a minute, hold on. You're a statistician. You're supposed to be completely shielded against any bias that I can introduce, right, Nate?
No, because you chose that question. It's a biased question. You chose that question out of all the possible questions you can ask, right? Like if I ask you,
he's back.
Well, yes, by definition that would be true, but go on.
Okay, so if I asked you, what's the capital of Georgia, the state of Georgia, right? Like, what would you think?
Well, the availability bias would say Atlanta. But
Right,
then
but
I'm
if I'm
afraid
asking you that,
I see where you're going with
If I'm asking you that, you'd be like, it's Macon or some shit. No, it's Atlanta, right? But the fact that you asked that question makes me think that it must be a surprisingly high answer.
I think you overthought it, is what you're trying to tell us. Is that fair?
He's just
I've
back.
never stolen anything from you.
Now, I will say, though, that I always give people the chance to explain their answer, right? So how did you come up with the 40%?
Because I thought it was a weird question. Because I remember at many jobs ago, you know, where you filed expense reports, right? And I wasn't making a lot of money back then, and like if you worked past.
Wait, he is a thief. He is a thief. This is where this is going. Just keep digging.
Shut off the cameras.
If you work past 8 p.m., if you work more than 10 hours in a day, then you were allowed to expense a cab home.
Is this like overtime? Or?
But what if you decided to take the train home? Hypothetically.
You're not helping, Nate. Move on. Move on.
So I was working those hours, or my friend.
You earned it, clearly.
I looked at, having run a retail business, I was looking at how much theft usually comes.
Shrinkage. They even come up with a new name for it. So
Yep.
it doesn't sound so bad.
Sure, shrinkage, and that was, and I was like, okay, it depends, but across most industries, it is around 5 to 10%, and I was like, okay, so maybe it's higher for employees. That was how I came up with my number.
That's totally fair. And you have good data.
Yeah.
Do another one. I won. I like these questions.
It depends on what we're hiring you for. There's a great study that I love that just came out that Emily Grijalva led, where she measured NBA player narcissism by coding. Get this. Wait, so there is
That means
variance,
there's a
Higher
Dale.
number than 100?
Contrary to your previous point, there is variance, right? Okay. They code it based on tweets. And the most narcissistic players, one of the tweets they captured was the tweet said, I look in the mirror, and then it's a picture of the player looking in the mirror, and what I see staring back is greatness. And some players don't
Usually they
choose-
have hashtag grinding right after
There
that.
you go, yes. Worship at the altar of grit and hustle. But it turns out that if you score high on the narcissism scale by your Twitter profile, that the team's mean narcissism and also maximum narcissism predicts fewer games won and also a poorer margin when you look at victory margin. And that's mediated or driven by having fewer assists, which seems to be like a proxy for bad coordination. And also, the longer those players play together, the teams with more narcissists are less likely to get better, whereas the teams with more humble players show more improvement over time. So
What is narcissism? I'm being serious right now.
So we would define narcissism as a sense of superiority and entitlement. So I believe I'm better than others, and I deserve more than others.
Isn't that predictive of NBA? Like, isn't that like a necessary condition almost to be an NBA player? Almost?
I don't know.
I'm serious.
You're the GM.
No, they get repeated feedback their whole life that they are superior to every person they encounter.
There's a grandiosity in it, though, here, right? Saying, like, I am the greatest human being that ever lived, right? Is what we might pick up
But
here.
they have overwhelming evidence they're correct.
But not relative to their peers in the NBA, right?
No, but once
So-
they get to the league, but like you think
Yeah.
like all their formative years, they're literally dominant over everything they encounter. So is it their fault that they're
No, it's your fault because
It's my fault. Okay.
you're reinforcing it. You're saying it's fine. They should all be narcissists.
So it's the
long as
what
they
they
win, they
have
can be
written in their
narcissists.
Twitter or what they write in their Twitter, like their description of themselves or what
It's
they're
their actual
posting,
tweets and
what
how
they're posting.
narcissistic those tweets are.
Oh.
And then you can also code their pictures for how much more attractive they look in their Twitter profile photo relative to their normal shot. Because the narcissists really want to put that best foot forward, right?
I think most people do though.
That might be true. But there, again, there's variance, right? So I'm curious about how you all look at these qualities. It sounds, Daryl, like you're not bothered by it.
just
Jessica,
wanna win.
Nate, like, do you think about, is their ego too big? And how do I either screen that out or how do I change it once I work with them?
So, well, my bigger concern is arrogance, and being part of a team. I think you need to give of yourself and understand that you don't know everything, and be open to asking questions and learning from other people. And the ways that I usually try to screen for that is like kind of asking people that what they have done that they've committed a lot of time to, and how they went about becoming better, and kind of how they answer that question I find to be incredibly insightful. Are they saying it's me? Are they talking about the people who helped and taught them? So, I think like a key qualifier for me is I don't care what someone has spent a lot of time doing that they are passionate about it. I just want something. It could be a musical instrument. It could be, they were really into coding. It could be whatever. It could be a sport. I don't care what it is, but as long as they've dedicated themselves and tried to become better, but also use the resources around them to become better. So, I don't know if that answers
Love
your
it.
question.
And so, Daryl, if you're going to assume that you have relatively big egos coming into your team,
Was it true in your paper that they're more narcissists in the NBA? It has to be true.
there wasn't a comparative analysis with other sports or other
Oh,
groups, so I can't
okay.
say.
Okay.
But it wouldn't surprise me.
Well, yeah, for me, like I'm just about winning. So if narcissism is actually a thing that will keep me from winning, I'm going to care a lot about narcissism.
Empirically, it seems to be. So,
I challenge that. I have to see the study. It seems like nearly impossible. They could have controlled for the variables you'd need to, like we would have to control for that narcissism, they've isolated that variable is what makes them lose. I think it maybe is highly correlated with something negative or something, but I can't live in correlation. I have to live in getting 7 narcissists versus 9 is going to tip me over some scale or something. That would maybe be something I'd worry about.
all right, so wait, let's complicate that a little. So it looks like narcissism hurts more if the point guard is a narcissist.
Okay.
Hypothetically, right? No, what I'm saying here is that...
What are you saying?
What I'm saying is... I give up. I'm done. No. Okay. I think that at least if you take the premise that the point guard drives a lot of the offense, then it's easier for the narcissist to kind of take control and maybe hurt the team's ability to get the right role player in the right spot. And so would you actually use that kind of information when looking at 2 point guards with relatively equivalent skill?
I would look at anything that helps me predict whether they're going to help me win.
So you're saying
if
you want to see the paper?
This is a new variable that maybe we could look at. I would say that if there's an assumption that someone who is more offensively minded at the point guard spot is negative, I know that there's more studies that that's actually a positive thing. So if somehow being more offensive minded makes you a narcissist, then I would say probably there's a positive correlation to being a narcissist would be my guess, but I haven't seen the study, so. And that's a modern NBA thing. Like, if you don't have 5 threats on the floor, it used to be the point guard could be a non-threat. This was in Jessica's era when she was the point guard. You could be a
And our teams were awesome.
yes, you could be in the Ivy League. You could be a non-threat.
You didn't play.
That's true. I know, I was terrible. You could be a non-threat at the point guard spot and do all the other point guard things and still be good. But now defenses are too good. You need. If you have non-threats on the floor, that they can scheme for you too well.
I'm sorry, I have to read one other text from Shane here.
Oh,
he
geez.
says, people call Daryl the Vitaly Potapenko of the pickup games. Straight bruiser, fouler, no other skills.
That's correct. 100% correct.
Disgust. No, I'm just kidding.
No.
No,
it's not
it is
discussed.
true.
Is it really true?
Yeah, Daryl and I have a lot of things that we disagree on. A lot of things we agree on, but one is when we have played one-on-one is I don't think it's appropriate that he just backs me down. He's much taller than me to score. He should play me like straight up.
I'm just winning.
It's all about winning.
He
all
actually
about
has
winning.
said, I have a statistically better odd of winning if I back you down.
That's true. As your skill level goes down, your thuggery has to go up. And it's not my fault she doesn't have referees. So
Oh, you're the Bob Probert of pickup. We've got it. All right, good. So I want to talk about, so we've talked a bunch about kind of assessing individual people's psychology and maybe some of the different traps we run into and ways to get around those. I think one of the things that's missing for me in sports analytics is culture assessment. And I know we think that just individual psychology is hard, right? Culture is even fuzzier, even messier, even harder to pin down. How do you think about gauging whether a culture is high functioning, productive, collaborative? What are the kinds of indicators you would pay attention to that might show up early before you see even the lagging results?
One of the things that I try to do each year is I actually do like a one-page questionnaire to everyone within whatever organization I'm might be overseeing. And Kager. I mean, I've been doing it for a long time, so it's not like a net new thing. But hearing from and asking people, what is it? How do you describe your job? You know, how do you describe what we do as a company? What are your aspirations? Things like that. To me, those responses are the most. I mean, it's kind of the feedback, qualitative stuff I mentioned earlier. But that's where I feel like I get the best pulse of not only how are people feeling about their job and is it clear what their job actually is. If someone is writing in and it's not clear, I think that I look at that and I say, oh, that's a concern for me. It should be clearly communicated what they're responsible for. But then, you know, more broadly, I want to understand what their aspirations are and that they are actually thinking about having aspirations at, in this case, Kager, because that means that they like the culture and they want to stay, right? So, one tool.
Others?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you want to, turnover is very costly, so you want to minimize involuntary turnover. I think you also want to look at like when someone leaves, where are they going, right? You know, we have a lot of young journalists. It's a high turnover industry, but like the people who wind up leaving, like get really awesome jobs elsewhere, and so we understand their motivation for why they might want to leave, and that can give you some insight onto what you can do better to make their culture better. But look, it's like anything else. There's like a wide variety of people, and some people are like, I'm going to be very much about like I compartmentalize my work, and I do a very good job, I'm very professional, and then I go home, and I'm not someone who is constantly checking email, right? And then people who like their life is their work, and like I think you have to be accommodating to both of those. It's weird though. We like wind up having like a disproportionate number of people that work at 538 come from the Midwest, which is weird because we're a company based in New York. So, and I'm from the Midwest, or from Michigan, so maybe there's some like unconscious bias or whatever in that hiring process. But the kind of Midwestern values of like humility and like conscientiousness, unpretentiousness, right? Those are things that I think make for better coworkers, and so it's a weird little pattern I've noticed.
I was just going to say, there's a Peter Renfro et al. Study that maps the 50 states on average personality traits, and the Midwest does come out pretty good on those metrics, so not that we're biased.
Ohio. Yeah, we're all from the Midwest, so
All
I
of
guess
us.
we are super biased right at this moment. So I think the nice thing about our sport and why psychologists like to study us is you can keep score. So I would say the highest performing culture would be the highest performing team, and the Spurs have been that. And their culture is almost unquestionably the best in the NBA for many, many years. Obviously set by great leaders like Popovich, great leaders like Tim Duncan. And they're leaps and bounds we're second, they're leaps and bounds ahead of us. We're like way down. And so and whenever I meet them, I'm always amazed by the foundations they put in place, and try to learn from them.
One of the things that I think is interesting is how do you transmit a culture from one team or one coach or one set of players to another? And you all live in the world where you have to deal with regular turnover and then say, okay, it's one thing to set a culture, it's another thing to sustain it. And there's a fun study that Samir Srivastava and his colleagues did recently where they looked at whether new people were fitting into the team. And they found that one of the best indicators of cultural adaptation was whether you as a newcomer swear in emails at the same rate as your teammates. And so if you swear too often or not often enough relative to the existing people, it's a sign that you're not picking up the culture and sort of reading the cues. And so I'm curious about whether you all pay attention to those kinds of signals. Are there things you notice that are kind of micro clues about whether somebody is kind of buying into the culture or whether they might be likely to reject it?
I like swearing.
Me too. It's a Midwest trait. Damn it. So, no, the way I can pay attention now, I'll shift away from the basketball team just to the team that is on the personnel and scouting side and the coaching side. And the people who don't fit generally are not talking. So I'm like always encouraging those who aren't talking to talk. And I get really frustrated when people don't talk, to the point where it's actually bad that I'm pushing people into doing something they're uncomfortable, which I don't really want to do. But I think if people aren't contributing and aren't any part of the back and forth, then there's something off. It might not be they're culturally not a fit. It could be just they're having issues at home. They're having something's going on. So I feel like, as the leader, it's my job to sort of understand better what's happening.
For me, it's very much about our people hanging out. We have a, beer Thursday kind of a thing. Are people hanging out and talking to each other? I mean, it's not any more complicated. Or at lunch, are people going and eating together? And I mean, I think if you are, then that's good. That means that you're kind of integrating in some form or fashion.
One of the other things I was curious to hear all of your takes on is the question of how to use data in a rapidly evolving world. And I think this is probably harder in the people and culture realm than it is in most others, because I think that the moment you discover something or release a pattern, the pattern itself changes, right? And there are all these feedback loops, which is, I think, one of the curses of having influence in a platform. But once that stationarity assumption is violated, how do you think about when to rely on data of the past to predict the patterns of the future, and when do you throw out the data that you've even gotten in the last couple of years?
I mean, I don't know if this applies to like analyzing the staff at 538 or our business per se, but like in other realms. I mean, look, what you ideally want is a data set that like spans multiple regimes, I call them, right? Or like, so one thing, for example, that's like quite robust in American politics is that the president's party tends to do poorly at the midterms. They tend to lose seats in Congress, as happened, at least in the House, in a big way last year as well. And in fact, that was true in the 1920s and the 2010s and the 1950s and whatever else makes it a lot more robust potentially. So kind of seeing which findings are contingent on a particular set of assumptions, a particular place and time, and which ones are more universal. I mean, that's a lot of like what the art, quote unquote, of statistical analysis is. And I think people, if anything, are too willing to throw out older data because they think the system has changed. Well, maybe it has changed, but the whole problem is like it's going to change again at some point. And so having tendencies that survive these big kind of spectacular changes in the environment in the past will make them more robust going forward.
I would say it's a core, incredibly hard and unsolvable problem. It's like literally the art of the job completely in terms of us using data to make decisions, in that you always have to be asking yourself, is the fundamental assumptions this model or prediction has been built on still apply? And then you then have, that sounds great, but then you immediately have his issue, which is as soon as you say, okay, I think it maybe doesn't apply, then you're like, okay, well, maybe I'm probably wrong. And there's really, it's still, you guys should study this stuff, because this is unsolved and super core. We don't know what window of data to use sometimes. We have to say like, oh, well, they changed this rule. Does that throw out every draft pick prior to, the perimeter touch rule or whatever? And the reality is we tend towards Nate, I think, which is we leave more in than take it out because of, black swan type stuff. Like it generally more data just more than not reminds you that you're clueless. Like it reminds you that things are really, most of the mistakes when you get really good data saying you got a great prediction, 90%, they're done right at that moment where things have shifted on you. And it plays out. And we have reliable data. This is the crazy thing. Like, his data is worse than mine. My data is better, but still bad. And then if you're just talking people, yours is even worse than his.
Well, I might argue that's not true. So, like, for example, this year in the NFL and Ticketmaster opened up this open distribution, which basically is now people can see who's buying tickets. That's new. It's all net new information. How many times someone is buying on the secondary.
New?
Who the person is to the person. Not that it's
You didn't know who was buying the ticket?
the secondary ticket.
Oh,
When
the
you
secondary,
might
thank
you might own a primary ticket,
Got it.
and then you're
Thank you.
selling it, who's buying it, who's
understand.
actually coming to the game. That's net new information. And so what you don't necessarily, you may have known last year that this ticket or this person you think attended 8 of 10 games, for example. But you learned this year that they actually only came to 4. I mean, just as an example. So does that fundamentally alter how you think about renewal? Well, the reality is you can't actually predict that this year because it's all net new information. You have to wait another year. So, I mean, it's exactly what you guys are saying, but that's the challenge. So the question is, you have all this great new information, which, by the way, we're getting more information every single day. 2.5 quintillion bytes per person.
You might have the best data. I'm changing my answer.
Sounds good. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think the challenge is, how do you continue to think about renewal? Do you still use some of that information? Yes, you have to, because you still want to predict renewal, but now you have all this other stuff that's so much more valuable. How can you dig deeper into that new data to get some kernels of truth that you can think about applying this year, even though you don't know what the actual result is going to be?
So then we layer in another complication, which is the question of how much does the individual actually, the star especially, shape the culture versus under the right culture, the individual flourishes. I think the Patriots example is a perfect one here. So is Bill Belichick great because he had Tom Brady, or is Tom Brady great because he had Bill Belichick? Jessica, can you settle this debate once and for all?
No problem.
And
No
remain
problem.
employed.
Yeah, so it's the crafts. So, no, it's a great question, and it's certainly one that I've been asked before, and I've thought a lot about it. And I think from a statistical perspective, or a data perspective, not statistical, the way that you can potentially quantify it is if you look at the product sales. So Brady's jerseys versus Belichick, everyone knows he has that cut-off sweatshirt. No, but I mean, so you could, in theory, look at those two, which are the ones that, if from a fan perspective, what are people, acclimating towards? What are they buying more of? And, as an example, when the original kind of Belichick hoodie was a Reebok one, and when Nike became the new, people who are making the jerseys, we bought like 8,000 jerseys, thinking it would last us like a while. And we sold out in like a year. And so, and I don't know if it's because people knew they were exclusive and they wouldn't come, but so there's that. And then Brady, of course, has been the #1 jersey seller for many, many years for the Patriots and then more broadly. So my answer is that I don't have enough data.
Can you guys help us with this?
I think this has been studied, and that it's known that it's incredibly hard for a very successful culture to survive, like the key person leaving. Like, you just look at the longitudinal survival of major companies, and it looks like it's incredibly rare for the culture to survive the original founding core person.
I mean, yeah, in some ways you're just happy to get like a good 5-year run or something, right?
Yeah.
That's a long time. Yeah. And in business, like to have a competitive edge for 5 years is like a long time. If you did it 2 or 3 times in a row and you see the Spurs and the Patriots being the 2 most obvious examples of where you survive a regime change and are still very good. I mean, I don't know. With respect to that narrow question, I think it's easier to find the impact of quarterbacks in the NFL than coaches, although coaches matter a lot in the NFL. So I would think Tom Brady is the more important part of that pairing.
And how would you help us quantify that? What's the perfect analysis?
I haven't done a ton of work in football. The work I've read suggests that quarterbacks are incredibly important. And that if anything, quarterbacks are underappreciated and underpaid relative to their peers in the NFL. So that's my understanding of the research that others have done.
Interesting. I did not know that. All right, let's take some audience questions here.
Can I ask
Unless,
you a question?
yeah, go ahead.
No, I have a question for you because you're studying culture. So who's the person who's creating the culture? Is it the coach or is it the quarterback?
I would assume that, I mean, I wasn't there, right? But I would assume
No,
that
but I
they're,
mean, you're now studying and coaching, you're watching coaches. Like, you know, what are you observing when you see how the culture is created?
can't turn the tables on me.
I just did.
It is your conference. Okay. I think a lot of it, I'd like to have better data on this, right? So, I mean, my dream would be to get a bunch of teams to agree to a coaching swap for a little while.
I mean, we do have evidence of Belichick not doing well in another environment, and we do not have evidence of Brady doing poorly anywhere else. I'm not saying
That's true, but we also have evidence of Brady not doing nearly as well at Michigan as he ultimately did with the Patriots.
Yeah, he maybe didn't get a chance, right? Wasn't he like the backup or something? I don't remember.
I mean, the
whole
fact
story.
that teams in all sports change coaches or managers every 3 years or so on average is probably a sign that at the very least they don't really know kind of what makes a coach good, right? I mean, obviously you do have turnover in quarterbacks in the NFL, but that's because the quarterbacks want to leave or get a better deal somewhere else or salary cap things, right? And so the amount of turnover suggests that maybe it's a lot of hocus pocus coach. That's not what I want to say exactly. But that like the hard skills can't be that hard if the context of like this guy you thought was the best coach for your team 2 years ago, and now he's fired based on things that probably aren't his fault. You know, it suggests like there's not that much differentiation maybe.
Yeah, I do think, I mean, the only study I can think of that speaks to this in at least a slightly controlled way was in the NBA. It's a Cornell study of what happens when a team basically moves to a coach who has no professional playing experience versus played in the NBA versus was an all-star. And they do find that there's an advantage of NBA experience, and then there's also an additional advantage of having a coach who was an all-star. What I would love to know is there selection bias in those data so that only the talented coaches who are
Yes.
good players make it, right?
There is.
But then also is there a respect thing, that they're not actually better coaches, their players are just more willing to go with them, and so the culture is more naturally and easily set by the coach under those circumstances. Jury's still out.
That's awesome.
So should we take some audience questions?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. I see no audience questions. Audience, ask some questions. Please, we will ask them.
Oh, he's got it there. There you go.
You have another one. Sweet.
There you go.
There are audience questions.
Yes.
All right. This is a good one. How do you determine what motivates prospective employees or hires or fans, and Daryl in particular? Can you tell which players want to win versus those who are just in it for the cash?
I don't care.
You
As
really
long-
don't care?
No, as long as they're helping us win a title, I'm fine. Whatever. I prefer they're in it. I do think like longitudinally having a big love of the game has been anecdotally a very positive thing. They put more work into it, but ultimately, like I'm mostly focused on can they increase our chance of winning the title. So I would say it's like a secondary factor.
Okay. Another question. Adam Silver mentioned earlier today that social media entices athletes to disconnect from their teammates. And I've actually heard from 2 NBA coaches this year that they're having another layer of problem with this, which is at halftime, players are going on Twitter and they're seeing really nasty comments and they're getting discouraged and it actually hurts their game. So how do you manage this and prevent players from getting sucked into the evil world of social media when it is evil? Jessica, this is something you see a lot on the fan side.
Wow. How do you prevent the players from
From getting distracted or getting discouraged or getting angry at
So
something that's not really about the team or the game.
So the question is how do we prevent the fans from writing mean tweets?
Potentially.
Wow, I don't know if there's an answer to that. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. I'm sorry.
I mean, your players have to have the life tools to handle a whole set of things. They've been yelled at if they played at Duke or something. They've had the most nasty things screamed at them. They handle way more negative feedback than you could ever imagine, a bad performance. So it's pretty rare, in my opinion, that they're letting the random Twitter troll affect their. If they are, then they won't make it because they're not helping me win. So off. Yeah.
I'm glad it's so clear
Well,
cut.
if anything, we maybe give them the tools, like we do with the media. We give media training. We give them some basic tools on how to handle situations, but beyond that, they better have the life skills by the time they get to the pros.
Okay. For anyone, question is, if you make a hire that later doesn't pan out, how do you have a productive conversation with that person if you don't want to let them go? And this could go for drafting as well.
I mean, I think the question is always asking them what it is that they want to do. The question that you asked Daryl at the start, or the first question from the audience is like, for me, I'm always looking for someone who wants to learn, because everything is evolving so quickly that they need to want to learn. And I think in the case of someone who, it sounds like the question is they're a great cultural fit, but they might not have the skill set, I want to ask them, you know, what is it that you aspire to do, and can we redefine your role to make you more productive within our organization?
What about when it's the opposite, that they have the skills, but they're maybe toxic to the culture? What do you say to them then?
To me, that one's about coaching, understanding the challenges that they're having, and then working with them. I mean, no one's perfect. And kind of our job, I think, as managers is to understand what are the underlying factors. And it might not have anything to do with work, and it might have something to do with work. But, I mean, I think of my job now today as being a coach. And I need to help people get better and mature and grow and become better managers or better analysts or better leaders.
Daryl, what do you say to a player who is capable of helping you win, but not living up to the culture that you're trying to set?
It honestly really depends on how good they are. So if they're not very good, then it's like a very like, look, get with the program or this isn't going to work out for you. And we have just pro sports. Everyone understands that it's a high turnover business, whether for cap reasons or whatever. So I think player movement is sort of built in. And so if they're a marginal player who's, you know, very bad for the culture, you know, creating negative things, not following what is being asked, then those players last very short. That's one thing we do well. We move on quickly. If they're an extremely good player that has those issues, then now you're trying to really help them understand how their behavior is hurting their overall. Everyone has the same goal. That's the easiest thing we have in sport. Everyone's trying to win a championship in our sports. That's easy. And so if they're very good but exhibiting those behaviors, you're trying to coach them into understanding how those behaviors are actually hurting their goal. You try and connect them to that. I would say that has limited success, though. Like generally, we get them farther along in their development that, you know, that maybe we're nudging them 5% one way or the other, but they're going to be who they are.
Nate, would you ever advise Daryl to draft or trade for a player who is an absolute star, but might be a problem for possibly unquantifiable culture reasons?
I mean, the NBA is weird in that, like, the value of being like an elite, like James Harden level, Steph Curry level NBA player is just, it's just so high, right?
Yep.
And it's also high relative to what the max salary is. And so like that makes it maybe in some ways like a fairly bad example, right? Where you can be a star for the Houston Rockets in a way that you can't be as like as a 538 journalist, right? Or in any other sport really, you know? No baseball player in the history of baseball has ever been as worth as much as James Harden is to the Rockets, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Maybe some NFL quarterbacks have been.
I mean, Barry Bonds was the closest, maybe.
Barry Bonds maybe was worth probably 12 or 13 wins a year above replacement.
Yeah.
So half as much roughly, right?
Yeah.
Ish.
Roughly. Ish, yeah.
All right. So in wrap up, what's the question each of you would most love to pose to the panel?
Why does everyone look at me?
Because you're the smartest.
We're just all looking to our right.
Yeah.
Just being polite, letting the lady go first. Mine's going to be to Nate. Nate, who's going to win the next election?
There you go. Good one. Yeah.
I mean, in terms of like knowing what you don't, I mean, I have no fucking idea. The single most likely person is Trump, but
That's
I'm
not
not
what
even.
I wanted to hear.
Yeah. I mean, but like, there's no good
But
way.
you would
to,
take field. Would you take field?
No, there's a bunch of new folks who are coming in right now from on the Democratic side. Who do you look at and say they have something that's special that maybe they're going to be able to make a push?
I mean, look, I think Kamala Harris is a candidate where she has some of the markers of successful candidates from the past, where she has a diverse coalition behind her. She has raised a fair amount of money so far. Apart from her, I mean, I think she's like kind of the front runner, but a front runner in the sense of like in the NCAA tournament, where like the favorite probably has like a 18% chance of winning or something, and they're not really much of a favorite. I don't know. I mean, beyond that, like Bernie Sanders has, I think, a high floor. He has very loyal supporters. I'm not sure how high his ceiling is necessarily. I think there are some candidates who are more moderate. Beto O'Rourke or Amy Klobuchar. Cory Booker potentially, who, I do think now that like the Democratic Party has drifted somewhat to the left, but there still are a lot of moderates in the party. So are there candidates, those three I mentioned, who could maybe unify the moderate wing and the more progressive wing of the party, people that could win the nomination potentially? But the thing is, nomination processes are like kind of literally chaotic. And I mean literally chaotic in the sense that like one small thing, right? Like in the Republican nomination process 4 years ago, when Chris Christie undercut Marco Rubio in that debate after Iowa, that was a moment when Rubio had been rising in the polls and finished third in Iowa and was like supposedly had momentum, right? So that like that one moment might have changed the whole trajectory of the GOP primary. When you have like 17 candidates, you might have 20 Democrats, then it is like intrinsically unpredictable beyond a certain level.
I have a question for Adam.
Yeah.
And then we got to wrap up.
Yeah,
It's
I
speaking of bad data, the data in your field is just awful.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's just terrible.
Thanks for inviting me, by the way.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, but it's really important data, but it's awful. So like, how
Your
do you?
data suck too.
What's that?
Your data suck too.
No, our data sucks too. I agree. Everyone's, but yours is worse. Not you personally. Not
Hey,
you.
at least I do
solve it.
randomized controlled experiments here where I can tell you what causes what.
Yeah, no, but there's so
But go
much
on.
correlation.
I'll buy your premise.
There's so much correlation. Like, how do you, like, I just reject so many studies, like, just offhand. I'm like, I hear them, I go, like, there's no way they control for everything. I'm not even gonna read it. How do you know, like, this is a good one?
I think you should be a little bit more open.
Okay.
Insofar as maybe
To
it can give you a
yours.
competitive, yeah, my studies only, clearly, no. I don't know, I have a few indicators. The first one is I look at obviously whether I think the researchers who did the study are statistically and methodologically rigorous. Second is did it meet the bar of a top journal? And then the third is did they actually pin down both the mechanisms and the boundary conditions? And so I think there's a lot of crappy correlational research, but when I start to see a bunch of evidence that like, oh, they thought to track whether assists actually drove the changes in performance, okay, now they're diving into how this narcissism dynamic begins to affect coordination. And we know coordination is relevant for a team to win, okay, now they're a little more sophisticated, right? And then, okay, did you look at how this plays out at different periods in NBA history? Or did you look at how this plays out as a function of how long the team has been together? As soon as you start to say, we're looking at when the effect is stronger and weaker, we're looking at when it's positive and negative, I think you basically show that you've got people who are foxes, not hedgehogs. And I trust their ability to run studies much more.
What's a study we should all leave as we all read to wrap up? What's one that everyone would be better in our jobs if we read it?
Everyone here would be better
Well,
at your
not everyone,
jobs
most people.
if
right.
you read one study.
Yeah,
Gosh.
like you have like a dossier of studies. It's impressive. You're like the whole time
Literally the only thing I'm good at.
moderating.
I don't know, it's hard to pick one study. I think for an audience that cares about sports analytics, I think one really cool study that I'm excited about at the moment is a study that Frank Flynn worked on a few years ago with professional golfers. And he found that if you were golfing in a major tournament with somebody who had a better average than you actually did better. And if you're golfing against somebody who
Like
was
the
worse, you
rabbit
did
greyhound
worse.
effect.
It seems like it. And I think that really often the thing we're most afraid of is to be right next to somebody who's better than us. We're afraid we're going to get psyched out, or we're going to choke, or I just don't belong in this league. I think the reality is, I just worked on a podcast episode about this, so I'm biased, but I think most of the time our rivals actually make us better. We learn things from them, they raise the bar for us, and you see this too with NBA players. When they get traded away from their team, they actually play better against their former team when they have to prove themselves,
that is for
right?
sure true.
So I think
no chance that's not
we could
true.
embrace our rivals a little bit more, and that's something we should all dive into.
Do they control for which golfer goes first? Because if
believe-
he's a good golfer, right, and you're like, okay, that guy tried that, and like that worked, so therefore I can try that too.
Look it up, Manatula and Flynn, org science, and I cannot tell you whether that was a control variable.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.